The doorbell rings, and something in you pulls inward before you've even decided how to feel about it. It isn't fear, it isn't anger. It's quieter than both of those things. A kind of bracing, the way a hand withdraws from something too hot before the mind has finished registering the heat. A moment ago you were settled, whole. Now you're on alert, and you can't fully explain why. You don't dislike the people on the other side of that door. That's the part that makes this so hard to talk about. If you're honest with yourself, though, the thought of letting someone in right now costs you something you can't quite name. You'll open the door, you'll smile, you'll offer coffee and ask about their week and mean every word of it. And somewhere underneath all of that, quietly, almost guiltily, you'll be counting down to the moment the door closes again and the house belongs to you once more. If any of this sounds familiar, you've probably spent years wondering what's wrong with you. Why the thing other people seem to do so effortlessly, opening their homes, their evenings, their attention to whoever shows up, feels to you like someone has reached into a locked room and started rearranging the furniture. Carl Jung spent decades studying people who feel exactly this way, and what he concluded was not what most people expect. He believed the discomfort you feel when your solitude is interrupted isn't something to be corrected. It's a signal, and it's worth learning to read. So stay with me for the next half hour, because by the end of it, you're going to understand something about yourself that most of the people around you will never fully grasp. Something that reframes a lifetime of quiet guilt into something closer to self-respect. Let's start with the space itself, because most people misunderstand what a home actually is to someone like you. For the average person, a home is simply a container. Walls, furniture, a kitchen, a bed, a place to store belongings, and sleep off the day. A place to store belongings. It is the single place in your life where you are not required to perform. Where the version of you that exists for other people, polished, agreeable, endlessly monitoring its own tone and timing, is finally allowed to stand down. Jung referred to this kind of space as an inner sanctum. He observed that people with rich, demanding interior lives don't merely occupy their homes, they recover in them. The home becomes the site where the mind reorganizes itself after the friction of the outside world. It's where a thought interrupted 3 hours ago can finally finish forming. Where an emotion you had to set aside during a meeting or a conversation is finally given room to surface and be felt in full. It's the place where being witnessed no longer has a cost attached to it. So when someone crosses that threshold, even someone you love, even someone whose company you genuinely enjoy, your nervous system doesn't register a social event. It registers a disruption. Not to your schedule, to something structural. The careful internal order you've spent all day building. The fragile balance between the self you show the world and the self you actually are. Depends entirely on solitude to hold its shape. He saw it as evidence of a psyche that takes its own inner life seriously enough to protect it, even at the cost of looking difficult or withdrawn to people who don't share that need. A person who cannot function without that interior space isn't broken. They are simply built for a kind of depth that requires protection in order to exist at all. Now, here's the part almost no one notices, even in themselves, because it happens too fast and too automatically to catch in the moment. The instant a visitor arrives, you put on a mask. Not out of dishonesty. It happens the same way your posture straightens when you walk into a formal room. Involuntary, immediate, learned so long ago it no longer feels like a choice. Jung called this the persona, the socially calibrated face we present to the world, shaped for whatever company we happen to be in. For most people, stepping into the persona costs almost nothing. It isn't experienced as performance at all. It's simply how they exist around others, seamless and unremarkable. For you, the shift is not seamless. It is noticeable, almost physical. You can feel yourself becoming a slightly different person the second someone else enters your space. Your words become more deliberate. Your expressions become more managed. Part of your attention splits off to monitor what's appropriate to say, while another part quietly continues thinking whatever it was actually thinking before the interruption. Maintaining that split takes energy. A very specific, non-renewable kind of energy that doesn't recharge through interaction. It drains through it, steadily, the way a battery drains under a constant small load you can't quite switch off. Psychology has a word for the broader pattern: introversion. But Jung's understanding of it was more precise than a simple preference for quiet. He framed it as a fundamental orientation of psychic energy. The introvert draws life force inward, from silence, from solitude, from an interior world that most people around them will never have direct access to. When the outside world demands too much of that energy for too long, When the persona has to be sustained well past its natural limit, the introvert doesn't just grow tired in the ordinary sense. They begin to lose contact with themselves. That loss, not the time spent, not the effort of hosting, is the real cost of the visit. It's the loss of self-contact, that quiet, continuous thread of inner awareness that keeps you feeling recognizably like yourself, from 1 hour to the next. Visitors interrupt that thread, and restoring it requires precisely the conditions a visit makes impossible: silence, solitude, a closed door, and the outside world held gently at bay until the thread reconnects. Jung believed that underneath the persona, underneath every careful social performance, every human being carries a deeper self still in the process of becoming. He called this the individuation process, the lifelong movement toward becoming fully, authentically who you actually are, rather than who circumstance and expectation have trained you to present. It doesn't happen while you're managing a guest's comfort or navigating the subtle choreography of a shared afternoon. It happens in the gaps, in the moments when no one is watching, no one needs anything from you, and your attention is finally free to turn inward and stay there. For certain people, and Jung considered this not a deficiency, but something closer to a calling, the pull toward that inward space is strong enough that even warm, well-intentioned company can feel like static interfering with a signal. Not because they dislike the people involved, but because they are in the middle of something important, something that requires exactly the conditions company tends to destroy. The quiet, often invisible work of integrating the unexamined parts of the self. The slow, patient process of becoming more fully who you already are, underneath everything you've had to become for other people. Every hour you protect your solitude, even when it feels antisocial. Even when it requires a polite excuse or a declined invitation you'll feel a flicker of guilt about, is an hour that belongs to that process. Jung didn't consider that self-indulgence. He considered it some of the most important work a person can do in a lifetime. If you've spent years feeling guilty for this, for the quiet relief that floods in when plans get canceled, for silently counting the minutes until a visit winds down, for the part of you that has occasionally, secretly wished the doorbell would simply stay silent, I want to say this directly to you. You are not cold. You are not selfish. You are not failing at some basic requirement of being human that everyone else seems to meet without effort. You are someone whose inner life is unusually rich and unusually demanding of upkeep. That inner life doesn't run on social fuel the way it seems to for the people around you. On the specific, irreplaceable experience of being fully alone in a space that belongs entirely to you, with nothing to manage and no one to account for. That isn't a flaw in your design. That's simply how you're built. And whatever guilt you've been carrying for it was never actually yours to carry in the first place. Stay with me, because Jung didn't stop at a diagnosis. He mapped out, in real detail, what's actually happening beneath the surface for people who move through the world the way you do. And there are 6 things in particular worth sitting with. The first is this: you absorb more from other people than they ever realize you're absorbing. When someone steps into your space, you don't just register their presence. You register their emotional weather, their unspoken tension, the energy they're carrying, sometimes without any awareness that they're carrying it at all. You feel this as real, and often as genuinely exhausting as physical weight settling onto your shoulders. This isn't imagination or oversensitivity in the pejorative sense. Jung called it unconscious perception, a heightened, largely automatic sensitivity to the psychic field of others that operates in certain people, whether they want it to or not. The second is that your psyche requires order to function well. A single visit, however brief and however pleasant, can disturb that order in ways that take hours, sometimes days, to fully restore. What registers for most people as a pleasant afternoon registers for you as a small reorganization project, one your mind will quietly keep working on long after the guest has gone home. The third is that solitude isn't emptiness for you. It's where your most important thinking actually happens. Problems that refuse to resolve themselves in the noise of daily life often find their answers in the quiet hours afterward. Feelings that had no room to breathe during the day finally surface and settle once the house empties out. Your solitude is productive in a way most people's isn't, simply because most people can't tolerate enough of it to discover what's waiting on the other side of the discomfort. The fourth is that your resistance to visitors is sometimes your shadow speaking. In Jung's framework, the shadow is the part of yourself you haven't yet fully faced or integrated. Old wounds, unresolved questions, pieces of yourself still being met and understood. Sometimes a visitor, without meaning to and without any awareness of what they've done, brushes against something in you that's still tender. The discomfort you feel in that moment isn't really about them. It's about what their presence has stirred loose in you. The fifth is that the desire for solitude, for people built this way, is often the beginning of something important, rather than a retreat from life. It isn't avoidance. It's a more honest form of engagement with your own existence. When you choose solitude deliberately, you're choosing to listen to something that gets drowned out the moment other people are in the room, the quiet, persistent voice of your own truth. And the sixth is that this need, this almost physical requirement for solitude, isn't something to be honored, because it is the exact condition under which you become most fully and recognizably yourself. There's something else worth naming clearly. What you're actually protecting, most of the time without fully realizing it, is a version of yourself that exists only in solitude. Not a hidden self, not a secret one, simply the version that doesn't have to manage anything, that doesn't have to be appropriate, considerate, or on. The version that can think at the actual pace of its own thoughts, instead of the pace conversation demands. The version that can feel exactly what it feels without first translating that feeling into something presentable for someone else's benefit. That version of you isn't antisocial, damaged, or afraid of connection. It's simply the most honest version of you that exists, and it cannot survive for long in the presence of others. Not because other people are a threat, but because their presence, however gentle, requires you to become someone slightly other than yourself. And becoming other than yourself, even in small temporary ways, is a cost that compounds the more often it's asked of you. Someone who needs solitude, and doesn't get enough of it, doesn't simply grow tired the way anyone would after a long day. They lose the thread of themselves. A restlessness sets in with no obvious cause. An irritability appears that seems out of proportion to whatever triggered it. A hollowness settles in that company doesn't fill, and in fact deepens, because more company is the last thing that can repair it. Jung saw this pattern clearly, and he didn't treat the need to protect solitude as selfishness. He treated it as sanity, the ongoing maintenance of the one resource that makes everything else in a person's life possible. A self that can actually be present when presence is genuinely needed. You can only give from what you actually have, and what you have gets replenished in silence. Not in the living room, not over coffee and conversation, but in that quiet, for the first time since the doorbell rang, you are completely, unguardedly yourself. The doorbell will ring again. That same contraction will return. The quiet, immediate resistance you've never quite known how to put into words. But now you know what it actually is. It isn't rudeness. It isn't damage. It isn't a failure of warmth, openness, or social capacity. It's a psyche that knows precisely what it needs in order to function at its fullest, and a self that requires solitude the way other systems require fuel or rest. Not as a luxury on the margins of a full life, but Jung spent much of his career studying the interior worlds of people who moved differently through life than the majority. People who needed different things, who were frequently misread, mislabeled, and quietly made to feel that the way they were built was a problem in need of solving. Something he wrote is worth carrying with you long after this. Loneliness doesn't come from having no one around. It comes from being unable to express what actually matters to you. You are not lonely because you prefer an empty house. You are, more often than not, simply most yourself there. It's one of the most honest things a person can do for themselves, and by extension, for everyone they show up for when it actually counts. The next time someone asks why you'd rather be alone, you don't owe them an explanation. But if you ever want to give one, you have the words for it now.